Darrell is the CEO of Ipsos Reid Public Affairs, where he has a finger on the pulse of Canadian demographic trends. I'd like to welcome Darrell. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jake. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning. I'm hoping everybody can see my screen. I know you're not supposed to say that, but I'm just going to ask that just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you this morning in Nanaimo. And as was mentioned by Jake, one of the most dynamic populations that we have anywhere in the country. And the changes that are happening in terms of demography in Canada are really quite astounding. But they're not just happening in Canada; they're happening all over the world. We're going through a very dynamic process of population change, and one which, quite frankly, a lot of people aren't really that well acquainted with. And so, the great way to start off any day, of course, is with breakfast and with a little data. So I'll provide the little data, and I know you're already picking up your breakfast. So I think we'll be in a good place to start your conversations today. So I love this quote. It's from Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. And it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And there's an awful lot about the Canadian population and even the global population that everybody thinks that they know, which happens to actually not be correct. And if you're planning for what the future is going to look like, you really have to have a good handle on what the population is going to look like, because quite frankly, that is the demand that's going to be in the marketplace. So what are we told about the global population, or in fact, the Canadian population as well? That the population bomb is going to explode. The 7.8 or 7.9 billion people that we have on the face of the earth is going to go up to 10.4 billion or more by the year 2100. So we're talking about just 80 years in the future, which is not an awful long time. Canada by 2100, some people speculate will have a population of about 100 million people. Lots of this growth is coming from the fact that we're having lots of kids, that there's a huge overproduction of children in the world. We have a large amount of births taking place. We have unsustainable population growth in many parts of the world that it can, quite frankly, when you add it all up, destroy our planet. And the power of youth will dominate our future. It just ain't so. And let me explain why. It's all in the numbers. What's going to happen is that the global population will peak about mid-century and decline probably about to the same level it is today, if not a little bit lower. As far as the Canadian population, I know people are saying it's going to get to 100 million people. We're at about 39 million people today. I think we'll be lucky to break through 50. That's still a really big number and a lot of growth, but it's certainly not 100 million. And what's driving all of this change? Well, urbanization, and you're certainly seeing this in British Columbia. Fertility, which drives most of the population growth that's traditionally taken place in the world. And finally, aging, which is becoming a much larger factor. I'm glad to hear that Nanaimo, most of the growth is among people who are 30 to 40 years old. That's not especially young. And in fact, when you look at the median age of a Canadian today, it's 42. So that's half the population is older than that and half the population is younger than that. Back in the 1960s, the early 1960s, the median age of a Canadian was around 23 or 24. So we are getting a lot older. But something has really had an impact on population trends, and it's something that late night comedians spent a lot of time on just prior to as we started into the pandemic, and that's COVID-19, obviously. And that the standard line was that once we ran out of streaming everything that we could on Prime and Netflix, that we'd return to the things that we used to do when we had a lot of time on our hands and people were together in their homes, and that's where we would have a lot of kids. But in fact, that's not what happened. In fact, we saw a huge depression in fertility rates. We saw disrupted immigration. We saw excessive death among the elderly, and the out-migration from cities. Some of it did take place. What we don't know at this stage of the game, though, is whether or not it's temporary or something that's going to be more permanent. But even if we do understand that some of it is going to be more permanent, was it more permanent because of COVID, or was it more permanent because of the price of the real estate that is at huge, historic levels in most of our major Canadian cities? That's what we don't know. Is it going to be temporary, or is it going to be more permanent? The depressed fertility rates, disrupted immigration, excessive death among elderly, absolutely true. That's why the Canadian population basically didn't grow in 2021 and 2022. It's recovering now, but during that period of time, the people who didn't come here aren't necessarily going to be coming here anymore. We have a lot of immigration in the country, but that period of time, we basically lost it and our population didn't grow. So in fact, exactly the opposite happened during COVID. We didn't have a huge increase in fertility rates. In fact, we had a huge decline. And the reason is, and it's quite simple, is when people are feeling optimistic about the future is when they have kids. And during that time, people were not feeling optimistic about the future. And quite frankly, they're not feeling that optimistic right now. But what really drove all of this change in terms of our population is really urbanization was the first thing. People moving to more urban parts of the country. And this is not just a Canadian thing, it's a global thing. So we talk an awful lot about immigration. Canadian story and population growth, particularly since the turn of the last century, has really been a story about immigration. And what we're seeing based on the UN's data is that the biggest migration in the world today is people moving from rural areas to urban areas. Now, we talk an awful lot about immigration, but the truth is only about 4% of the world's population doesn't live in the country in which it was born. Now, the number is much, much bigger in Canada. In fact, Statistics Canada released some new data on this yesterday, and it's 23%, which is the highest we have ever seen in Canada of the Canadian population is foreign born. But only 4% of the global population actually doesn't live in the country in which it was born. Most of us stay pretty close to where we started our lives. And that's a global phenomenon. But this idea that we're stay in the same country, by the way, is what I'm trying to say. But in terms of where they live, we've started to move overwhelmingly to urban areas. And it's been a long time trend in Canada as well. The last decade, and the blue arrow shows you when it was, in which 50% of Canadians lived in an urban environment and 50% of Canadians lived in a rural environment, was the 1920s. Most of our population growth now is in car commuting suburbs. And the reason for that is people are looking to buy homes close to where the jobs are, and the type of homes that they want to buy are usually single family dwellings in places in which they can have their own yard, their own parking lot, that kind of middle class aspirational dream. That may change over time, but right now even though we've traditionally had a housing pressure for low income housing and dealing with homelessness and there's urban housing issues, what we've seen through the course of the last 5 years, and particularly over the space of the last couple of years, is that we're now seeing much more pressure in the area of what I would call middle class aspirational homes. That's why inflation has moved up to the top of the list. One of the reasons inflation has moved up to the top of the list in terms of most important issues facing the country. And it's also why housing, which we've really never seen on the list before, has moved up to such a high prominence in terms of people's public concerns. And the reason for that is because that middle class aspiration is now under threat. Why? Because more and more of us are moving to those urban environments. The real growth in Canadian population has not been people moving out to rural areas or moving back to communities that were previously suffering, although there are some communities that are like that. Overwhelmingly, it's been people moving a fairly short commuting distance to a major metropolitan area. What's happened through the course of COVID, and also because of real estate prices, is we're seeing that circle of what is an acceptable commute pushed out. But it's not like they're moving to a 5-hour commute. They may be moving, if it was an hour was the acceptable standard before, maybe they're moving to 90 minutes. And the big shift we've seen in our population. So in the gray bar is the distribution of the Canadian population back in 1961. So 60 years ago. 2021 is what it is today. Actually, that should actually read 2000. No, that's 2021 was the census was done. So that is correct. What we've seen is a major, major shift of the Canadian population from the east to the west. So Atlantic Canada has declined considerably. Quebec every day looks more and more like Atlantic Canada in terms of its population distribution. The growth has been in Ontario, the prairies, and overwhelmingly in British Columbia. So when Jake said what he said about population growth in the Nanaimo area, absolutely no doubt. That's what the data show. And I mean, if you could live in Nanaimo, why wouldn't you? It's an amazing place. But what this has had, this huge amount of urbanization in the world has had, is a significant impact on fertility. And that's the number of kids that we're bringing into the world. So the magic number, or we could say the most important number in all of this, is what we call the replacement rate. The replacement rate fertility is the average number of children a woman has in her lifetime. Today, or the replacement number in a place like Canada is 2.1. And by replacement, I mean replacing the number of people who are expected to die in any particular year. So just to keep the population steady state, no immigration affecting this, it's just the number of births replacing the number of deaths, you need 2.1. And basically what that is one for you, one for your partner, and a little bit extra for those children who unfortunately don't make it into adulthood. So 2.1 is the number of a perfectly replacing population, just staying steady. Last year, we had the lowest fertility rate in Canadian history. It's 1.4. We're almost a full kid short for population replacement. But China last year recorded its lowest fertility rate too, at 1.2. The Chinese population, and I'll show you the data on this in a second, is in the process of collapsing. It's not something people talk about. I mean, you hear an awful lot about the economic power of China. You hear an awful lot about the military threat that China represents. Very few people talk about the demographic crisis that China is in right now. By the way, India's already passed China as the most populous nation in the world, if we had accurate data. Demographers know this. It's just the governments have to actually owe up to it. But India's already passed China. So huge amounts of outmigration from China, young people immigrating from China. We're not going to see that as much in the future. In fact, that's why you've seen China drop down the league table in terms of sources of immigration to Canada, and rapidly being overtaken by India and the Philippines. But India, for the first time in its history, dropped below replacement rate last year. Now, I bet you didn't know that. Everybody assumes that there's so many children being born in India that the birth rate is out of control. No, it's now below replacement rate. And our neighbors, the United States, slightly higher than Canada, and that's because their population is a little bit younger than the Canadian population. At 1.6, their lowest fertility rate in history. Those three countries that I just went through, China, India, and the United States, are the three largest populations in the world. And they're all below replacement rate in terms of fertility. So why is this happening? Number one reason is urbanization. Lots of kids on the farm, lots of free labor. Lots of kids in the city, very expensive. So people do what's economically rational. They have fewer kids. On the farm, they're contributors to the net family wealth. In the city, they don't, generally. So you do what's economically rational, you have fewer of them. The empowerment of women. When women move from the countryside to the city, their lives change. They get exposed to different types of role models and different types of opportunities. They decide that they don't want to live the same lives as their grandmothers lived or their mothers lived. And as a result, one of the first things that they do is they reduce the number of children that they have. And the reason for that is they want to pursue independent incomes, which requires an education and a career path, and all of that reduces the number of children that a woman has. So really, a couple of really good statistics in the Canadian situation that will point this out. By the way, don't just listen to me. Look at your own families and look at your own personal situations. There will be some outliers that go in other directions. There always are. But in general, this will be the pattern. Back in 1960, the average Canadian woman got married around the age of 21 or 22. She had her first kid shortly after, and she had 4. That was the average. Today, the average Canadian woman, if she gets married at all and decides to start a family, it's probably around the age of 30. She has 1 kid, possibly 2, although the number one household frequency of a child in the household today is a single child. She possibly has 1, might have 2, but almost never has 3. The only way the population grows is if people on average have over 2.1, so 3 kids. And ask yourself right now, as you look around all the people who are there in the room, particularly if you're in the age in which you're considering this decision about the size of your family right now, how many of you have 3 kids? And think about your own kids and the possibility that they're going to have 3 kids. And the reality is that it probably looks somewhat like a funnel, the generations. Go back to grandma and grandpa, they probably had larger families. Then your mom and dad had a slightly smaller family. You've had a slightly smaller family, and your kids are probably going to have a slightly smaller family. All of it is because of the changing decisions that women, who are the decision makers on this issue in most places, have made about the size of the family that they want to have. We no longer celebrate large families. Small families are more the norm. It's the thing that we see. If somebody has 5 kids down the block, they're a real exception in your neighborhood. But guess what? Not just in your neighborhood, just about every place in the world other than the Sahel in Africa or Nigeria. There's been tremendous success of government and NGO programs in countries that were previously had really high birth rates, unsustainably high birth rates. The programs that have been put in place in terms of birth control have been really effective. They've worked. And the gender and age structure of the population. Every day, the global population gets less capable of reproducing itself. And that's because the population is aging very rapidly. And the biology of reproduction is the same as it's always been. The odds of having kids when you get older are less than when you're younger. In fact, it's really interesting when you take a look at birth rates now. The birth rate of women over the age of 40 in the United States, I think it's probably pretty similar in Canada, is higher than it is for women under the 20 years of age or younger. So you're more likely if you're 40 to have a kid than if you're 20 and under to have a kid. And it used to be very, very dramatically different. And of course, as I showed you as a result of COVID-19, the comics were wrong. We didn't get together and do what we used to do and have lots of kids. In fact, we just absolutely suppressed our fertility. And given what's going on in the economy right now, I don't think that the bounce back that people were expecting, I think there's going to be some bounce back, but it's not going to be as big as people thought, mainly because of the economic stress that we're under. The last time we went through something like this was back in 2008, which had a huge suppressing effect on fertility rates. So all of this leads to inevitably population aging. The average Canadian today lives to around 81. By 2036, Statistics Canada tells us it's going to be around 87. In the 1920s, the average Canadian only lived to the age of 57. So in the space of just over a century, we've added 30 years to the average life of a Canadian, which is amazing for all the reasons that you could think people are living longer. We're less likely to die accidentally. All the medical breakthroughs that we've had, but most of the big effects on population health have been actually things that relate to changing habits. We're eating better, we're exercising more, we're smoking less, we're not using alcohol as much as we used to do. And there's been a lot of government interventions on things like safety. So for example, people wearing seat belts now, all sorts of workplace health and safety activities and regulations that have been put in place have had their effect. So we're living a lot longer. But the population back in the 1920s was much more capable of reproducing itself than the population today, simply because the median age was lower, much lower. So this was what the Canadian population pyramid looked like in 1960. Now, this looks like a bit of a rocket ship, but let me explain what it looks like, or what all this means. On the left-hand side of your screen are the number of men in the population at that age. In 1960, the lower you go down, the younger the person. Same thing for women on the right-hand side. And this relates to the year of birth. So the higher you go up, the older you are, the lower down, the younger you are. This is why it's called a population pyramid. It absolutely looks like a pyramid. 1960 was just at the tail end of the baby boom, which ended in 1964. The Canadian population at this time looks like a perfect population pyramid. As I said, the average number of children being born back then, 4, the median age in the low 20s. This is the Canadian population pyramid today, 2020. Pinched in at the bottom, because we're having a lot fewer kids, and that trend line is both for males and females. And you can see the expanding top as we're living longer, and that bulge that's working its way through the pyramid, like an anaconda swallowing an antelope, is the baby boom. Median age of this population, 42. Birth rate today, you saw 1.4. This is how our population is changing. It's not dominated by the young, it's dominated by the old. The fastest growing population in Canada are people over the age of 80. We're in the process of flipping the population pyramid. And the stress that you're seeing there is very, very real, particularly for the people who are in the middle right now, the sandwich generation. Taking care of older parents and trying to take care of fewer children, but children nonetheless. And to make this population pyramid actually more accurate, what I would do is I'd take one of the elderly gentlemen off the top, because the older population is disproportionately female. Every year, I should just go through the statistics, but when you look at the gender distribution of births in Canada, there's always slightly more male births than there are female births. And by the way, every country in the world in which there isn't an artificial intervention to favor male births, in places like India and China, you still see that. But you still have a slight advantage to male births. By the age of 40, in all the places where there isn't this artificial intervention, the difference is eliminated. And the reason for that is because men die fast. Why? They don't listen to their doctors. They drive like maniacs. They're 3 times more likely to kill themselves than women. All the things that you can do, smoke, drink, all the things that I talked about previously, men are more likely to do them. And as a result, that difference is eliminated by the age of 40. And every year after that, there are more women in the Canadian population than men. And by the time you get to 100, and there's about 10,000 Canadians today who are 100 years of age or older, the number's 5 to 1. Who's selling anything to older women? Who's building anything for older women? Who's targeting political campaigns to older women? The answer is nobody. They're largely an invisible population. In Canada. Nobody really pays attention to them, but they're going to be an increasingly powerful part of the population because there's more of them. Back in the 1970s, there was more men in Canada than there were women. Today, there are more women than there are men, and that gap grows bigger and bigger every year, and it's due to population aging. So when I'm thinking real estate, yeah, 30 to 40-year-olds, that's really interesting. Young families, that's really interesting. Who's building anything for older women, who, by the way, disproportionately live on their own? And that's the point here. One-person households now dominate in Canada. Single-person households are the fastest growing group but they're also the largest group. It used to be a couple with children. Now it's either a couple with children or a single person, couple without children, or a single person living on their own that makes up over half the population. But when we think about, okay, we're building family homes, we're thinking about couples with children. It's only 26% of the population, folks, and declining. So who's building houses for these single people? And these are disproportionately women at the start of their lives and women in the latter part of their lives who fit into this category. Nobody advertises to them. Nobody makes anything for them. Nobody even talks about them. But as I said before, they're going to become an incredibly powerful part of our future. Women over the age of 50, please pay attention to them. But how have we been able to offset the difficulties that we have with declining birth rates in Canada? Immigration has been the Canadian solution, which, by the way, from a political perspective, is almost impossible just about anywhere else in the world. There's a really good column that my co-author who wrote Empty Planet with me, John Ibbotson, wrote today in the Globe and Mail on how immigration is working in Canada and what the effect is and how it helps our political situation, but also helps us round off the harsher aspects of population change. I suggest that anybody in the room, if you want to take 2 minutes to read it, it's a really good update on what the latest data is showing. So Canada still has a growing population, stunted over the space of the last couple of years, but in general, still growing, about an average of 1% a year. But not overwhelming, just kind of growing a little bit better than a lot of other places. Take a look at, by the way, at Russia. Great time to start a war when your population is already shrinking. They're killing off the next generation of Russians, the next generation of Russian fathers. Japan, very similar. Japan loses about 500,000 people from its population every year. Their population is absolutely shrinking every year. And Italy loses about 50,000 people from its population every year. So does Spain. Why? No kids. So what's Canada do? Well, immigration, and the number keeps going up, particularly under this government, but not exclusively this government, the Harper government, the Chrétien government, all the way back to the Mulroney government. Big increases in immigration on an annual basis. We're bringing in now more than 1% of our entire population every year. If you take a look back at 1970, who were they? Basically from the UK. And up into the mid 1980s, the UK was still our number one source of immigrants. And the US, back in 1970, obviously people fleeing the draft in the United States, but not exclusively, but big influxes of people from the UK and from the US. Take a look at what we see today. The UK is not even on the chart. Overwhelmingly India. China sliding down, Philippines moving up, but we're also now starting to see Nigeria move up. France still a little bit, the US still a little bit, Brazil a little bit, but overwhelmingly India is where people are coming from. And anybody living in British Columbia, this is no news to you. And the share of population and share of immigrants, where do immigrants really go? The red shows the share of the population, which I showed you in previous chart. And then the gray bar shows you the percentage of immigrants that actually move to that place out of all the immigrants that move on an annual basis, overwhelmingly more to the prairies, about where it should be in British Columbia, about where it should be in Ontario. But take a look at Atlantic Canada and Quebec. Now, in the most recent census data, we've seen Atlantic Canada move up a bit. The problem in Atlantic Canada is people may immigrate there, but they don't necessarily stay, they leave. Same problem in Quebec. They may go there, but they have a tendency to leave. But Quebec is getting far lower proportion of the overall immigration intake than any place else in Canada. And their population is starting to look increasingly like Atlantic Canada's, which is the oldest population in the country. So immigration, one way to deal with the fact that we have a collapse in birth rate. And as I show you in this chart, immigrants overwhelmingly move to urban areas. Now, as the Statistics Canada data shows us, they're starting to move further out, but it's not like they're moving to Timmins. It's not like they're moving to Prince George. They tend to be clustered around car commuting suburbs of larger and medium-sized cities. Statistics Canada tells us, and I'm sure they're going to be updating this with with their newest data, by 2036, 30% of Canada will be immigrants. In fact, the number that they put out yesterday is that 23%, almost a quarter of us are now immigrants. 50% of us immigrants and their Canadian-born children. 30% of us a mother tongue other than English or French. 40% of us visible minority. We might have to be changing our definition of what that means going forward. And 16% non-Christian religions. This is a huge, huge push on diversity. And it is virtually impossible anywhere else in the world. This is the kind of thing that's causing political strife in the United States. It's causing political strife in the UK, one of the reasons behind Brexit, causing strife in Italy, one of the reasons that we saw the election that we just saw, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, various places in the world in which immigration has started to ramp up. The public has pushed back, and we haven't seen that in Canada. In fact, the leaders of all the major parties in Canada are all supportive of large amounts of immigration, mainly because they know the issues that we're dealing with. So where do we go from here? This is what the top 10 countries in the world are going to look like in terms of population going forward. So 2017, China, 1.4 billion. As I said before, India is pretty much there now and has passed them. But some of the most recent demography, and this is, by the way, estimates that were done prior to COVID, and the numbers in China and India are going to even drop faster than this. But India has already moved ahead by 2100. Nigeria in second place, China dropping rapidly, losing almost half of its population this century. And where are we going to see the growth? We're going to see it mostly in places like Africa and Asia, outside of China. Even India is going to experience a decline in population. So this is a very different world than the one that we're experiencing right now, and it's going to happen really rapidly. Why? Because we're going to experience a global population bust. We're going to get to between 8 and 9 billion people by 2050 to 60, and then the population is going to start to decline. And we're going to end the population with the century with a population about the same size as it is today, but distributed very differently. It's not good. It's not bad. It's important, though. We're going to grow more from aging and immigration than from fertility, because nobody's been able to turn this situation around. Nobody. The Nordic countries have the most aggressive pro-family policies in the world. Everything, from work balance, paternity leave, maternity leave, all sorts of benefits, all of them are below replacement rate. There's going to be a dramatic shift in the population structure. We're going to be older with diminishing fertility and smaller families. So when you're thinking about houses of the future, start thinking about families that look like this. I would suggest. Start recognizing the power of older women and how important they're going to be for household formation going forward and for commerce. We've become a metropolitan species, and we're basically emptying out the countryside, and we continue to do so. We're going to see the decline of China, the rise of India, and the rise of especially of Africa. Canada, we're going to see the growing power of the suburbs, because that's where people are moving, and Western Canada in particular. We've shifted to the West. 2011 was the first year in which more people lived west of the Ontario border than lived east of the Ontario border in Canada. All of this is good for the environment. If you're concerned about climate change, a smaller population is something that you're probably going to think is a good thing. But it's really, really difficult for commerce. Economic growth, given that a lot of our commerce is driven by consumption, particularly since the end of the Second World War, who are going to be the consumers going forward? That number is going to be shrinking. And they're going to be older, which means they're going to be buying less stuff. You buy stuff at the beginning of your life, you don't buy it necessarily in the same way at the end. And as a result of that, economic growth is really going to be challenged. And so is innovation, which tends to be a young person's game. We're about to experience the great retirement. It's not 50 years off, it's happening now. By the year 2030, every single baby boomer in Canada is going to be 65 years of age or older, but not just in Canada, everywhere in the world. It's happening now. The Great Decline, the 2040s, will be the final decade for boomers when they start leaving this mortal coil in very, very large numbers. Once the decline starts, it's impossible to predict when, how, and at what level it will end. And by the way, all of the decisions that are going to make this happen have already been made. They were made by your grandparents, they were made by their parents, your parents, they were made by you. All we're doing now is just living through it. So the options, you can just accept it and prepare for the inevitable. I would strongly recommend, as you start thinking about your longer term plans or even your medium term plans, this would be a good position. Understanding the demography of what's going on in Nanaimo, and I love that both the speakers before me spent some time on that, critical. Who is that future Nanaimo population going to be? Guaranteed it's not going to look like the ones that's there now. Mechanization. An awful lot of talk whenever we get into the conversation about what the future is going to look like, about challenges for the workforce, what we're going to do in terms of, finding workers. The easier challenge to deal with. You can change retirement. You can look at robots, which is what they're doing in Japan, which, by the way, the median age is 48 in Japan. So they're looking at a whole lot of mechanization. But the problem with all of those things is they don't buy anything. They only produce it. And the question is for who? We need to rethink retirement. The idea that somebody can retire at the age of 60 when they're perfectly healthy and capable of working longer, and in many instances want to work longer, is something that we're really going to have to rethink, because we simply can't replace them in the workforce. We need to keep them in the consumption part of their lives for a longer period of time. And they want to be there. The last ism that we put up with far too easily in the workplace when we think about employment is ageism. And we're not going to have the ability to do that in the future, because we're going to need older people to stay around for longer. Why? We just don't have any young people. We're running out of them. And finally, rethinking immigration. And this, as I said before, is the Canadian solution, but in many, many other countries, not possible. It's driving the political disruption that you're seeing out there. Donald Trump was largely driven by people's reaction to immigration. There's going to be an absolute pummeling for the Democrats in the upcoming off-year elections. Again, a big factor in that, obviously, gasoline prices or fuel prices and the cost of living, but also what's happening at the southern border is really upsetting a lot of people. But you're seeing that in many other countries as well. But immigration is a short-term solution. But even the places that we're getting immigrants from, as I said before, their populations are aging and declining as well. So what I would put in a strong argument for today is diversity and necessity. And that's, stop thinking about diversity in the workplace when you're trying to deal with this as something that shows the goodness of your heart, although it does show a good heart. It actually is a necessity. We absolutely need every person who's prepared to work and be employed or start a business or do whatever. We need to be welcoming of them, because we're absolutely going to be needing them given what's happening with the structure of our population. So that's our future. If you want to read more about it, you can certainly pick up next, in which I focus on what's happening in Canada and really drills down into a number of the issues that I talked to about today. But you can also read Empty Planet, which John Ibbotson and I look at it on a global basis. So thank you very much for your time and attention. If anybody's got any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Well, thanks very much, Darrell. It's very, very much a reality check, a bit of a sobering analysis for a Thursday morning, but I think really critical for us to understand this. I think understanding the fact that with these trends towards population decline, towards urbanization. I mean, we are while we're meeting here in one of the largest cities on the island, we are a very diverse region with very urban, suburban, rural, remote, indigenous communities. It's the whole diversity of communities, and all of these things need to be considered as we move forward. Now we only have time for maybe one or two questions from the crowd. So we have Julie and Julie are in the crowd here with their microphones. So if there's anyone who wants to speak, just put up your hand, please, and we'll try to get to it. Got one over here.
Thanks very much. That was a fantastic presentation. I'm curious in terms of the demographic trends that you've pointed out in countries around the world, to what effect climate change and climate change-driven migration will factor into that, and even if the population numbers are declining, whether there will be a push factor to places like Canada that are better placed to mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The problem that we have on climate change right now in population is we really don't know. A lot of what's predicted about the climate, unlike the demographic things that we're dealing with, in which the projections, as I said before, the decisions were already made and we're just living them out. Climate change is something that the size of the human population, for example, has potentially an impact on. And I've seen very little. In fact, John Ibbotson and I were only able to find one study in which when we were writing Empty Planet that actually looked at what a lower population would do for climate change, which is what our future is going to be. So we're not really sure what the effect is going to be. At the moment, most of the speculation about where climate change is going to have an effect is obviously in places like Africa, also in Micronesia and those places. But at the moment, there really aren't a lot of people moving as a result of that. There may be moving as a result of famine, but most of the famine in the world today is really politically derived. It's not being driven by the climate. So at this moment, it's a little difficult to say exactly what's going to happen. There's opportunities for mitigation in some of those places. There's things that we can be doing in terms of trying to alter the human effects on climate that could have an effect on that. But as I said, at the moment, the UN's really not tracking anybody that they describe specifically as a climate migrant. My suspicion is there will be some in the future. We just don't know how many. And we don't know, we have a good sense of where they're coming from, but we don't have a good sense of where they will be going to. And so there's a lot of stuff to be worked out on that question.
We have time for one more question over here.
Thank you again. Your information was greatly appreciated. My question is, how are the global leaders viewing Canada's decision, which seems to be quite a paradigm to the approach of the other countries? Are we actually looking at a leading edge position on the global stage? And is there a chance that other countries will take our lead and follow suit?
Well, the issue, I think people who really focus on these questions look at Canada and say, of course, this is what you need to do. But Canada, and I put a tweet up on this morning, not anybody's following me on Twitter, but I said, we're a very, very special place. The only other place, and it's still rockier than it is in Canada, that has been able to achieve this is Australia. And by the way, when you look at the Global Values Survey, the two countries in the world, in the English-speaking world, that have the closest values are Australia and Canada. So it's really not much of a surprise. But they're unique. Most countries can't deal with this amount of cultural change as a result of immigration without having huge amounts of political disruption. So I think that politicians and people who are involved in public policy and looking at the effects of population change may understand what's going on, but politically, the solution that Canada's put in place or Australia has put in place is not directly available to them. And the reason for that is because of the political disruption that it causes. The biggest driver of nativist, particularly populist political pushback in the world today, and we're seeing it in many, many countries, is this issue. And so it's not really possible. I mean, the Swedes still want to be Swedish. Finns still want to be Finnish. Danes still want to be Danish. And they see this as a threat. The general population sees this as a threat to the continued existence of that concept. In Canada, we don't really have the same desire to push back. The sole exception to that is Quebec, where you are seeing a very similar type of pushback to the one that you're seeing in places like Western Europe. So yeah, they understand the logic, but politically the solution isn't as easily available to them as it is to the national government, and particularly to provincial governments in places like British Columbia, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta.
Well, thanks very much, Darrell. Any final comments before we conclude?
Other than just, keep on the same track that like I said before, that you're on. Like I said before, I was really heartened to hear your introductory comments and Jake's introductory comments, in which you started from the perspective of looking at the population and looking at demography and dealing with facts. And I would invite anybody who has an opinion about this type of thing to go back to my first slide, the Mark Twain quote. It's not what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that's wrong that does. So just make sure that what you know for sure is right. And a good place to start is the topic that we talked about today.
Well, I will invite Jake Rudolph to come forward and thank you and comment on that as we conclude the breakfast. Jake.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Darrell, for a very interesting set of comments. I can assure you that everybody in this room was fully paying attention to everything you said, and I think reflecting on what it means for your respective roles in society and your places that you live. Again, you mentioned housing, you talked about seniors. We're well known for seniors in Vancouver Island. A lot of people choose to move here, and we have on our economic development side, we see this as a tremendous asset to mine the tremendous wealth of experienced and strong professional people that have chosen to move here. And so it's one of our strengths. It struck me what we're seeing here in Nanaimo. It's interesting because you said housing needs to be designed and built for seniors. So does some of our programming as a municipality. We're seeing it's maybe a little lighter topic, but pickleball, it's crazy. Squeezing out everything else. There's change that in terms of the services that we're being asked to facilitate. It's moving out. We're using existing facilities for that. So on behalf of this organization and all the folks in the room today, I want to thank you for your presentation. You've given us a lot of takeaways on this. And because you're not here, we're not able to give you your gift in person. We'll be sending that to you shortly. And
thank you
very much.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great meeting.